joining us this afternoon to discuss fiscal guardrails, global debt levels, and looming government spending pressures. I'm Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Global public debt to GDP ratios have climbed in the past 2 decades as countries have rolled out fiscal stimuli to respond to shocks such as the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, countries are facing pressure to scale up spending on everything from defense to domestic programs, underscoring the necessity of stabilizing debt and imposing strong fiscal rules. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to discuss these issues and to learn from the International Monetary Fund's new research note, Fiscal Guardrails Against High Debt and Looming Spending Pressures. The run of show for this event will be very straightforward. After my brief introduction, I'll be delighted to welcome Dr. Raphael Lamb, Deputy Division Chief of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF, and Dr. Julian Akelin, an economist in the Western Hemisphere Department, to present the new research note. And then we will have a panel discussion. I will introduce the panelists when the panel discussion begins, but they are Era Dabla-Norris and Jerome Zettelmeyer, with more extensive bios to come. Following our panel discussion, the panelists will welcome questions from the audience. Please submit your questions to my colleague John Toohey at john.toohey@aei.org or on X with the hashtag AskAEIEcon. The spelling of all that is available on the webpage for this event. Thank you all again for tuning in, and thanks to everybody who will watch a video of this event later on at your convenience. And with that, let me invite Raphael and Julian to present the findings of this new IMF research note.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, to the webinar. It is our pleasure to present at the American Enterprise Institute today, and Julian and I will present some of the key findings of a new report that the IMF released today with respect to the fiscal guardrails. As a motivation, Michael has already mentioned that there's a high debt across countries. For example, global public debt is expected to be rising over the couple of years. Even for countries that have stabilizing debt, risk to the debt outlook is expected to be on the upside. When we look ahead, governments are facing mounting demands to scale up spending for the aging populations, defense, as well as on the development needs. The uncertainty surrounding the fiscal policy are also on the rise. So these underscore the importance or the need to establish very strong fiscal guardrails in order to foster discipline and manage the rising demand of the public services. So as we are going to look into it, many countries have adopted fiscal rules, which are the long-lasting numerical limits on spending or the deficits, and which is designed to contain the excessive spending pressures as well as the rise in debt. So this presentation will look into 3 questions. Number 1, we will look into how have countries changes in their fiscal rules, particularly on the period after the pandemic. Do these changes address some of the pre-existing challenges? Second, we will look into some of the principles or areas that the fiscal rules can be better designed in order to improve some of the compliance as well as contribute to the successful soundness of the public finance. The last question, which is also important in the sense that as countries face a lot of the spending pressures, whether or how the fiscal rules should be adjusted in response to that. So moving on to the first question. Our new research also comes with the major update of the IMF Fiscal Rules and Councils database, which contained important information about individual countries, including the revisions since the pandemic. For example, in the chart that we shown here, our updated database reveals that fiscal rules on the rise, particularly for the emerging markets and developing countries over the last 3 decades. As of end of last year, over 120 countries have at least one fiscal rules, and many of them have combined different set of the fiscal rules in their operation. Look into deeper about what are the features of the fiscal rules. We see that we have been able to track what are the desirable properties, such as strong statutory basis or the linkages with the medium-term plans, as well as the presence of some of the flexibility clause or the correction mechanisms to provide flexibility, as well as to manage some of the deviations of the rules. Result shows that earlier rules tends to be more rigid in the past and not legislated in the law. Fiscal rules did not have supportive features. Over the last couple of decades, we see there have been efforts to introduce greater flexibility, such as stronger role in terms of the use of the escape clauses, and most of the rules are increasingly being seen in the legislation. However, the rules have in many countries seems to be still falling short of the fiscal oversight, as you see on the left chart. And also there seems to be a lack of the effective correction mechanisms across many countries. On the right side, we also see that the compliance with the fiscal rules tend to be weak, particularly in the emerging markets and developing countries, and tend to be uneven across countries. Noting that the challenges in measuring the compliance, our new research presents a host of the complementary indicators, such as the deviations from the rule limits, as well as how they are assessed by the national authorities and our IMF country team. Certainly, the pandemic has tested the fiscal rules framework, leading to 2/3 of the countries with fiscal rules revising them in order to accommodate some of the new challenges. They have taken different approaches, ranging from introducing new full fiscal rule limits, as well as extend some of the horizon to meet with the rules. But more importantly, some countries such as European Union, as well as the United Kingdom, have revised more significantly to their framework. Nonetheless, despite those revisions, we see that many pre-existing challenges still remain, but new challenges has also emerged over time. Let me pass to Julian for some of the analysis on the second question.
Thank you. So as Raphael mentioned, policymakers face increasing challenges in aligning fiscal rules with the broader objectives of fiscal policy. The policy challenge here is to design a rule that is going to preserve fiscal discipline and mitigate sovereign risks while allowing for counter-cyclical stabilization and productive investment in the long run. The revisions to the rule should focus on strengthening their design and implementation, which in turn will improve compliance with these rules. So there are three important factors which we highlight in our study and which I'm going to touch upon in this presentation. The first one is the choice of a prudent fiscal anchor. The second one will be the establishment of a robust correction mechanism that pre-specifies the fiscal adjustment path to guide the return to that anchor. And lastly, I will talk about the role of strong fiscal institutions. So first, fiscal rules can encourage the buildup of fiscal buffers by setting up a prudent fiscal anchor. So how should this medium-term debt anchor be calibrated? So here we suggest to proceed in two steps. The first step involves estimating the maximum sustainable debt a country could afford. This maximum sustainable debt limit can be linked to key macro fiscal parameters in the country, but it is important to highlight that there is some uncertainty around this number, both across countries and over time, as can be seen here on the left-hand chart. The second step involves estimating the risks to the outlook at the country level and leaving some buffer so that with high probability, the debt will not exceed the debt limit in the medium run. The chart on the right illustrates this methodology, which allows us to obtain a prudent calibration for the fiscal anchor, represented here on this chart by the black dashed line. So here I focused on the debt anchor, but of course, the anchor could take many forms, which are discussed in our notes. But in any case, I want to highlight that it is important that this anchor should be tailored to the country characteristics, be observable, and easy to communicate to the public. Second, the introduction of robust correction mechanisms can foster fiscal rule credibility and reduce sovereign risks. Most countries do not have a correction mechanism to manage deviations from or non-compliance with their rule. While corrective correction mechanisms vary across countries, what we think defines a robust mechanism is a mechanism that guides policy and demonstrates commitments in a predetermined manner. It should require a tighter fiscal adjustment when debt risks become higher, and also balance the trade-off between procyclical policies and complex design. The updated IMF database on fiscal rule identifies 6 countries with a fiscal rule that contains a robust correction mechanism that specifies a gradual tightening of fiscal stance through concrete measures when debt rises above pre-specified thresholds. Our empirical analysis on the right uses synthetic control approach and sets the treatment date T0 as the legislative approval of the fiscal rule in those 6 specific countries. Our results show that the introduction of a fiscal rule with a robust correction mechanism contributed to a significant and long-lasting decline in the sovereign spread in these countries by about 25%. So for the average country in our sample, which has a sovereign spread of about 300 basis points prior to the introduction of the robust correction mechanism, this translates roughly into a 75 basis point drop in the spread. Just to offer a point of comparison, this effect roughly corresponds to the spread differential today between French and German bonds. Lastly, implementing and complying with fiscal rules requires supportive fiscal institutions, which are entities responsible for the formulation, the execution, and oversight of fiscal policies. So the lack of supportive fiscal institutions contribute to a few shortcomings when implementing the fiscal rules, including often optimistic macro fiscal forecasts, weak links to the medium-term fiscal framework, or lack of independent oversight. So as can be seen on the right-hand chart, many countries with a fiscal rule today do not publish a medium-term fiscal framework ahead of the budget presentation. So we think countries should strengthen independent fiscal oversight, which can take different forms, including independent fiscal councils. To secure the operational independence, fiscal councils should have a well-defined mandate, budget safeguard, and a timely access to information, as well as direct communication with the media. Why is this important? Well, our empirical evidence shows that effective fiscal rules and councils, measured by their strengths, contribute to a more restrained fiscal discourse, as can be seen on the left. This means that in these countries, there are more important calls for a reduction of budget deficits and limits to public spending from political parties. Strong fiscal rules are also associated with lower fiscal surprises, both on deficit and debt, as can be seen on the right-hand chart. Here, the surprises are defined as the difference between the actual fiscal outturns and the one-year-ahead projections. Quantitatively, we find that the effects are important. Strong fiscal rules reduce debt surprises by about 2 percentage points of GDP, which is about 5 times the average level of surprise in our sample. This suggests that strong fiscal frameworks would help improve compliance. With that, now Raphael is going to talk about the revisions of fiscal rules in response to rising spending pressures.
Thank you, Julian. So the last question is regarding how fiscal rules could be revised in response to the spending pressures that many governments face. This is an important issue because the fiscal rules are sometimes seen as constraining investment, particularly because they impose limits on the aggregate budget envelopes, but also because governments tend to cut investment spending during the consolidation period to preserve some of the current spending. So here we present a conceptual framework to illustrate the key considering factors. Countries have, in the framework, countries have binding fiscal rules in which their deficit or expenditure limits are at the ceiling levels. The simulations here we are considering for illustrative purpose is to have 1 percentage points of GDP additional growth enhancing investment for the next 10 years, and we illustrate 3 cases with different initial debt level shown in the bottom chart with respect to low debt, high debt, as well as very high debt levels. The model certainly assumes some endogenous and nonlinear effects of how government borrowing cost on the debt will vary according to the debt level, as well as a pass-through from the borrowing cost to the private activities so that it acts as an amplification channels. This means that the probability of debt distress would rise with the debt level as shown in the right chart. This model framework gives us a few important insights in terms of the design of the fiscal rules. The model details as well as some of the results are shown in our latest paper. Here we highlighted some of the important insights with respect to the design of the fiscal rules. Number one, exclusion of the expenditure rules tend to lead to a debt buildup. So if some of the additional investment are excluded from the rules, certainly countries will be able to abide by the rules, but at the same time, debt will continue to build up, which could undermine the debt sustainability concerns, especially for those high debt countries. This also opens the opportunities of misclassification of spending. In the case of the low debt countries, the second important findings on the inside is that there are room to ease the fiscal rules in a modest way in order to accommodate some of the growth-enhancing investment, which could yield more sustained output gains with manageable debt dynamics. Here, the chart shows that, for example, on a sustained level of increase of investment in the left chart, additional investment would require deficits that adds to debt, which is shown on the middle chart. That is expected to return to a declining path after the investment horizon, and the associated fiscal multipliers tends to be larger than while it's maintaining an overly tight rules. On the right-hand side, showing the multiplier effects, which tends to be higher and particularly important for the debt finance growth enhancing investment. The simulation shows that endogenous fiscal multiplier are likely to be higher when debt is low because there is sufficient fiscal space that could avoid a cut in the government expenditure. However, the third important finding is that this may not be feasible at all for high debt countries. Relaxing the rules to allow for additional investment, which is debt finance, would tend to raise the debt to a more unsustainable path because of the associated rise in the interest rate, with weaker output effects as well as more unsustainable debt path, which is shown in the middle chart. The simulation result shows that for advanced countries, starting with a debt level of between 110 or 140% of GDP, additional debt financing investment would increase the debt ratio by 12 to 24 percentage points of GDP. However, the output gains will be much slower or more muted, with a multiplier of about half of the initial level when the debt level is low. It is because the interest rate would tend to surge as debt rises. This implied that additional investment would need to be offset by other fiscal measures, such as raising tax or cut down some of the less targeted spending with low efficiency. In those cases, adjustment of the fiscal rules should be more carefully calibrated in order to preserve that sustainability. There are also practical considerations when adjusting the fiscal rules. For example, one could temporarily ease the fiscal rule limits for the investment program, then commit back to a tighter rule in order to maintain that sustainability. A second approach would be to exclude temporarily multi-year investment expenditure from the fiscal rule limits in exchange for an immediate or permanent tightening of other spending limits. Both options will present some risk, as we highlighted in the slides, either lead to some of the misclassification of spending or subject to political incentives to prolong the extension of the investment program. Countries with strong fiscal institutions could have the independent oversight in order to check the realism of the forecast, as the rule limits are sensitive to some of the macro fiscal assumptions. However, countries without a fiscal strong oversight or capacity may find these options much less practical. As a sum up, let me summarize some of the few takeaways from the presentation as well as from our new research paper. Certainly, some of the components of the fiscal rules have remained weak, as we showed in the data, despite rules are less rigid. There are some design considerations when revising the fiscal rules, as Julian pointed out. Countries will need well-calibrated fiscal anchor in order to encourage the build-up of a buffer. There would need to be a robust correction mechanisms to guide the investor expectations and anchor the people expectations of what government would do in case deficit or debt exceed the fiscal rule limits. There are important roles that the fiscal institutions, such as macro fiscal forecast, medium-term framework, as well as the fiscal institutions, fiscal councils that could provide supportive to the implementation of the fiscal rules. In face of the spending pressures, it is tempting for countries to exclude expenditure from the rules, but we see that they will pose some debt sustainability concerns. As such a result, adjustment must be carefully tailored to the debt sustainability concerns while maintaining some of the integrity as well as the transparency of the fiscal rules. Let me summarize it by presenting some of the recent work that IMF has been put forward today in terms of the staff discussion note on the fiscal guardrail, as well as some of the database that we are updating in the fiscal rules and councils. Let me stop here and then return back to the stage to Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, which I think does a great job of summarizing the research note. Let me transition the event to the panel discussion, and let me introduce the panelists. Era Dabla Norris is a deputy director in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, where she leads the work on the IMF flagship report, the Fiscal Monitor. Previously, she was in the Asia Pacific Department as mission chief for Vietnam. Prior to that, she was a division chief in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department. Jeroen Zettelmeijer is director of Bruegel. He was previously deputy director of the IMF's Strategy and Policy Review Department, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, director general for economic policy at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, among other important policy and research appointments. So let me welcome Era and Jeroen to the stage. Let me remind the audience, please, to send in your questions via email to my colleague John Toohey at john.toohey@aei.org or over X using the hashtag AskAEIEcon. John will be sending some of those questions to me as we proceed with the panel discussion. Just an opening observation, it's so refreshing to be part of a conversation about fiscal responsibility and taking the fiscal challenges facing various governments seriously. And so I really commend the IMF for this report and appreciate Julian and Raphael's presentation, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. We need more discussions like this in Washington and in various capitals around the world. Let me start with Era. Countries seem to find it hard to return to fiscal rule limits when they have high deficits and high debt. The majority of countries revised their fiscal rules post-pandemic, and yet they still find it hard to comply with the revised fiscal rules. What do you think is driving that? What do you think governments can do when there are repeated violations of compliance? How seriously should we take this? Your general thoughts on this?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you so much for hosting us at the AEI. So let me start with sort of a fundamental sort of political economy issue, which is that there tends to be a present bias in policymaking. In other words, governments like to spend more, and so this kind of trickles into each successive government, no matter where you are, wanting to spend more and finding it harder and harder to retrench that spending once it's out there. So this kind of a present bias that's inherent in any policy making tends to make it much harder for countries around the world to come back to return to some sort of rule limits. And so to your point about what can we do, I think it's important to know that we don't see that there being a magic bullet. There is no one formula that countries can do. I mean, countries differ in terms of initial conditions, in terms of debt levels, in terms of sort of accessibility to markets. But in the note, we've tried to identify some elements of what could help countries sort of chart a course to more to greater fiscal discipline, to greater responsibility, and to also to attenuate fiscal risk. So the first element that we highlight in the note is thinking about having some kind of a prudent fiscal anchor. Now, this could be debt to GDP, debt, gross debt, net debt. It could be some sort of a structural balance rule or a balanced budget rule over the medium term. Whatever the rule is, it should account for the kind of debt risks that countries face. And there needs to be some sort of an operational limit. You could have a budget ceiling or a spending ceiling or some kind of a spending rule that connects your sort of what you're doing on a day-to-day or an annual basis with this anchor. And having this kind of a framework, either legislated or in practice, can help encourage greater fiscal discipline by guiding fiscal policy to reach the anchor over a medium-term horizon. So key element, account for risks and have a more medium-term horizon that's tailored to country circumstances. A second element that we emphasize in this note is to have some sort of a robust correction mechanism. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you're going to overshoot, say, your rule limit, have some sort of a pre-specified trigger. Or some kind of that triggers when you exceed or your deficits or your debt exceeds some kind of a threshold, and the government says, well, I'm going to take these kind of corrective measures in order to minimize sovereign risks. Several countries have done it. In the note, we discuss what these countries have done, and the important point here is that we find that this has helped lower sovereign spread. So markets respond positively to this kind of correction mechanisms. A third component, which is really the institutional pillar, and Raphael and Julian talked about this, but I can't speak of this enough. You can have the best rules in place, on the books, legislated, but if you don't have the forecasting capacity, if you're not linking what you're doing on your annual budgets to what's happening over the medium term, then you're losing the plot. If you don't have the right kind of institutions that provide oversight or transparency in sort of an independent channel to communicate the path of fiscal policy, then it's much harder to have the kind of compliance. So we see this as being as an extremely important linchpin of the broader framework for making your rules work and coming back to the rule limits that countries have established.
Thank you. That all makes sense. German, let me ask you about Europe. And we're in Europe, I think, is in a particularly difficult position. Many European countries have very high debt levels. There's increasing concern from investors about the fiscal outlook of some European countries, and that's kind of colliding with political gridlock or political deadlock, challenges for political systems, and that is in turn colliding with rising defense spending needs as a consequence of increasing geopolitical risk and of the United States potentially taking a step back from offering security guarantees in Europe. So how do you think about blanket exclusions of spending? The research note we're discussing cautions against those. But if you're advising a European government that's facing market risk, political risk, and the need for greater defense spending, how do you kind of square that circle?
Thanks so much. Great pleasure to be with you. And I also thought it was a really fantastic paper, and I could elaborate on why I think that. But I want to mainly answer your question. So let me make a point on the fiscal situation in Europe and then specifically address your point on how to accommodate higher defense spending and whether this requires exclusion criteria in the fiscal rules or not. So generally, the fiscal situation in Europe is a bit better than the way you characterized it. So, European countries generally pay pretty low real interest rates, lower than the US, for example. And it's not generally, the problems that we have are not a problem of debt being too high. So we have the country with the highest debt levels. Greece also has a pretty noticeable primary fiscal surplus and actually pays a very low interest rate. I mean, unbelievably low compared to what we would all have expected a few years ago, lower than both Italy and France at this point, even though they have far higher debt. With respect to, setting aside for a minute, and I will get back to it, the issue of higher spending pressures in the future, be it through defense or through demographics, Europe really only has a France problem. It doesn't have a problem beyond that. And the France problem is not one of excessively high debt, but of a political deadlock that makes it very difficult for France to adjust in the amounts that most observers, the European Commission, the IMF, and ourselves would view as necessary to stabilize the debt. So it's not a problem of very high debt, it's a problem of very high deficit, and the inability, apparently, to find political consensus to cut that deficit, in spite of the fact that the government is keenly aware that it has to, and it has put forward good plans, not unrealistic plans to actually do it, right? So that it's a very specific problem. It's not unlike problems that you have seen in some emerging markets in the past, where there is, in effect, an inability in parliament to ratify the essential steps. So that's the problem we have. That's the first order problem. Now, what is also true is that several European countries are under pressure to spend more on defense, and they have aging populations, and we have a significant demographic problem, bigger than the US. And by the way, in this respect, France is actually better than most other countries. That needs to be addressed by increasing fiscal adjustment in the future. And so then the question is whether this adjustment can be, whether you can improve the trade-off, if you like, between adjustment and flexibility by fiddling with the fiscal rules themselves, right? These exclusion criteria. And basically the paper says, well, the obvious, the first reaction that you would have, which is, can you improve something just by excluding it? Well, sure, you can exclude, but you're going to get higher debt. You're going to water down the rules, right? So the basic sort of obvious answer turns out to be the actual true answer that's supported by the analysis. And so, the first lesson I would draw is, when countries are close to their actual debt limits or are viewed as having a difficulty to reduce their deficits, then no amount of fiddling with the fiscal rules is going to help them. They just need to adjust. Now, there are a few, maybe a slightly more hopeful question, or the practical question is then, how do you reconcile in practice this desire or need to spend more with the denial to do fiscal adjustment, right? Guided by rules, and what role could potentially the design of the rules have in improving that trade-off? And so here I have two things to say. So the first is you can exploit the fact that in some cases, it's not true for demographics, it's not true for a large part of defense spending, but it is true when you're trying to close investment gaps or when you're trying to rearm. You may have to undertake large but temporary increase in spending that are for a specific purpose. And if that's the problem that you have, it has a fairly easy solution, which is that you have to exploit the fact that even though this may cost you 10% of GDP, it's a one-off, whereas the fiscal adjustment that you need in the rest of the budget to make this sustainable over time is in principle permanent. And so, you know, a 0.1 or 0.2 improvement in the underlying fiscal position, depending on your spread between interest rates and growth rates, could be enough to actually pay off that extra 10%. And so what we then need from the fiscal rules is that the fiscal rules do not stupidly stand in the way of a strategy and actually incentivize such a strategy. And unfortunately, in Europe, that's not really true. So we would need an amendment to our fiscal rules to allow that sort of strategy. Now, again, this is about temporary things. Now, other than that, I think the key to ameliorating this trade-off between trying to spend more on some items, just needing some item more, and having to manage down your debt is, you know, try to make it as cheap as possible. So lower the fiscal costs of whatever you're trying to do, right? Don't take this as a given. And so in order to lower the fiscal cost of rearmament, in particular, you need to create more competition, essentially, in the European defense market. And that is a very difficult thing to do because, you know, in Europe, countries are caught in defense industrial nationalisms, even within the EU, and EU rules don't really force them to open their markets to competition. And then finally, there is, of course, the last resort that when it comes to financing defense goods that have a public good character, right? In the sense that they protect a whole geographical area, not just a specific country, that's an excellent argument to justify common borrowing to actually create that structure, right? And so that is something that Europeans will have to go down that route. For various historical reasons, we're extremely reluctant to go down that route. But if common borrowing is linked to common ownership of defense assets, it is really clean from a sort of incentives point of view. This is not common borrowing to just give money to a particular country to spend on whatever it wants. It is common borrowing for a specific purpose. Then you build a good governance structure around it. So bottom line is there are solutions to these problems, but they go far beyond just the design of fiscal rules. Having said that, you know, sometimes fiscal rules are an unnecessary constraint, and then you have to tweak them.
Excellent. That's very enlightening. You know, we had a question come in. I'm assuming this question is from an American, but it's kind of a back to basics question that I think could be useful to answer. And you know, the gist of the question is why should we care about debt and deficits? You know, I think maybe what the questioner is trying to ask is, you know, aren't the things we're borrowing for worth borrowing? How do you maybe Era, we'll start with you. How would you answer that?
But why do we care about debt and deficits? I mean, it's, you know, it depends upon which country we're talking about. But you know, we've written extensively at the IMF about, you know, debt is not a bad thing. If you're borrowing to build your productive capacity, it makes a lot of sense. But then it also begs the question, where you start, what is your starting point, right? So just to think of where we started out prior to the pandemic and or even prior to the global financial crisis and where we've come. So what we see is that in a large share of countries that account for 80% of global GDP, debt is now higher and rising faster than it was prior to the pandemic. In most countries, debt levels are higher than they were. They're not necessarily rising, but they're higher than they are in the pandemic. At the same time, you have more spending needs. Jerome talked about defense, but you know, developing countries have other developmental needs that are also really pressing. At the same time, we have this population time bomb for many advanced countries that countries will have to spend for it. The entitlements, think about social spending and healthcare costs. These are major costs that governments will have to contend with. And then, so this is sort of the spending pressures. The other reason why we care about all of this is because the upward trajectory means higher borrowing costs. It means higher borrowing costs for governments. It means higher borrowing costs for individuals. It means that investors require higher premium to hold government debt. And that gets translated into higher cost of borrowing for everyone in the economy. So there's macro impacts of this debt. And for governments in particular, which is what the topic of this conversation is, it means much less room for maneuver. It means that your debt servicing costs, you're starting up from a high level of debt, your debt servicing costs are high. Your deficits are adding to your debt servicing costs, and that's eating into other kinds of possibly productive spending that the government could be doing. In addition to, if you're an emerging market economy, there's also a whole slew of sovereign risks associated with having high levels of debt.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would answer from a U.S. perspective. A lot of the debate we have about the U.S. fiscal outlook kind of implicitly assumes that the only real cost of debt is the possibility of some sort of financial crisis or major market event that might occur at some point in the future. And what I would underline, Era, from your answer are two additional considerations. The first is that the U.S.'s structural deficit is driving up interest rates for everyone in the economy. Your mortgage rate would be lower.
Exactly.
If the structural deficit were lower, your car loan interest rate would be lower. If the structural budget deficit were lower, your credit card interest rate would be lower. Importantly, interest rates on standard commercial loans would be lower. And so you would see more business investment. Workers would be more productive. Their wages would be higher than they currently are if the U.S.'s structural deficit was more responsible. And so I think the question is often asked, when will the debt be a problem in the U.S.? And my answer would be around the year 2005. That's when it will be a problem. In other words, it's been a problem for the last several decades and will be a problem going forward. And then the second part of your answer, I would highlight in response to the question with respect to the United States is that the IMF note is focusing on governments, and there is in the United States, in my judgment, a real kind of political crowd out happening, where the ability of the U.S. to make spending investments is, I think, hampered by the size of the structural deficit, and so there's a real kind of prioritization happening. Let me ask another question that came in from the audience. It's a little bit more of a similar kind of a more of a back to basics question. The question is, I understand that a relatively small component of total government spending is discretionary. Again, I suspect this person's from the United States. Are fiscal rules on expenditures meant to constrain only discretionary spending, or are there some for mandatory spending as well, such as pensions? I don't know.
Maybe I'll just kick off, and then maybe Jeremy can come in as well. So the bottom line is the fiscal rules are meant to encompass all spending. And the reason you want that is because you want to have an idea of what your overall spending envelope is. That's important from a macro perspective as well, right? You need to know what the trade-offs are. I think the one word that we haven't spoken of in all of this is trade-offs. I mean, as economists, we know how important that is. And so you want to be able to understand how much are your outlays, either today or in the future. You also need to know, how much am I spending now and how much will I have to spend in the future? So there needs to be this kind of a link between, maybe you're going to have a larger payout in terms of pension costs in 5 or 10 years down the line, but you need to have that bridge between spending today and what it implies for your ability to spend in the future. But Jerome, please come in, and I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Nothing to add.
So when thinking about fiscal rules for the U.S., I'll tell you both kind of how I think about this, and then you can react to it, or you can discuss how that might apply to other nations. I think in the United States, the specific debt to GDP ratio doesn't really matter. But what matters to me is the shape of the curve. And so in order to avoid a painful adjustment, I think the kind of first step is for Congress to stop making the problem worse. And so if we could kind of bend the curve so that the debt to GDP ratio stabilized at current levels, I think that would be an important first step. And then I think it's important in the United States that within the next 10 years, that curve be pointed down. And in my view, that would be enough. And I'm kind of agnostic about the velocity with which the curve points down. I'm agnostic about hitting a specific target. I think you want it to stop rising, and you want it to start falling, and you want that to happen, in the near term or medium term, not in the long term. So react to that. Is that bad advice for the U.S., good advice for the U.S., or think about it in terms of other nations? Is that bad advice for other nations? How do you kind of react to that? German, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. So first of all, I like that way of thinking about it. I think about it roughly in the same way. And we at Bruegel, we have actually done some work on estimating the size of the fiscal adjustment that would have to occur to do what you are saying. And we did this even though we're not US specialists, mainly because we were doing this work on European countries. And then we decided to, just for the fun of it, apply the same methodology to the US. And so the answer is you need a fiscal adjustment in the order of between 5 and 6% of GDP. And this is based on, CBO baselines after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So it takes into account the newest legislation. You would need to take about 5 to 6% of adjustment to achieve what you're saying, and that's a lot, right? And what makes the US a bit different, I think, from virtually all European countries is that it's not so much the size of the required adjustment. It's very large in the US, but it's also large in France, and there's some countries with very large deficits. Yeah, Romania happens to have a deficit of almost 9% of GDP, so that's going to be even larger. But the big difference between the US and Europe is that in Europe, there's sort of a consensus that countries have to do something, and virtually all European countries have put forward plans, medium-term plans, to actually do what you're saying, Michael. So do this bending down of the curve, and the EU fiscal rules, they say you have to do it within a maximum of 7 years, not the bending down, but you have to execute the plan that then will start bending it down after the 7 years with 70% probability. But the US doesn't. In the US, there is no consensus that it actually has to happen, and I think that has to do, I think, with the uniquely privileged position of the US, that markets are really willing to finance the US deficit in a way that's rare in the rest of the world, and fiscal authorities in the US have kind of become used to this, right? The last government in the US that was really serious about doing what you are saying was the Clinton administration. So that's a long time ago. Okay, so I think I would be worried about this, but the really difficult conceptual thing is to decide. I mean, we can all agree that debt stabilization must happen eventually. We can also, using reasonable methods, figure out how much fiscal effort that requires. But what is super hard to figure out is how fast do you have to do it, right? I mean, your instinct was, yeah, a maximum of 10 years, right? if the US had an IMF program, then the adjustment horizon would have to be 3 to 4 years, because that's what the IMF does. If the US were in Europe, you would talk about 4 to 7 years. Now, the US is kind of special. It has more patient markets, so maybe it can take more time, but how much more time? And that's the point where we have a really hard time giving a systematic, data-based, rigorous answer to that question. I should note that in the paper that we're discussing, there is sort of an attempt to do that. They approach it in a different way. They don't approach it by saying, here's a way to figure out the length of the adjustment period to achieve debt stabilization. Rather, they approach it by saying, let's figure out sort of a maximum debt level that should not be exceeded, right? They call that a debt anchor, I guess.
Anchor.
Right? A debt anchor, even though it's supposed to be really a limit. And then basically they have this conceptually very nice two-stage approach, which I think was briefly on Julien's slide, of how you figure out that anchor, which is you first come up with sort of a theoretical absolute maximum beyond which debt no longer can be stabilized. And then you build in a big buffer. And the size of the buffer depends on on sort of risks and shocks. Now, I think that's intellectually a very respectable way of doing it, but I doubt this works in advanced countries. And the reason why is immediate from Julien's chart. If you look at the example he chose for the debt limit, it was like 80% of GDP. Now, if you actually figure out these debt limits using standard methods for advanced countries, we have tried to do this for the EU, you get debt limits way above 200% of GDP. And then you have to ask, what is an appropriate buffer? So we're not going to be able to tell France, an appropriate buffer is 130% of GDP. So somehow, in practice, I think this approach might fail, except for countries that have very high volatilities, or for some limit, these debt limits are lower. So I still don't know how to solve this problem, how much time to give a country to adjust. So I'm
going to jump in, and I completely agree with everything that Jeroen is saying. I think it's really hard to pin down. And I think, Michael, I like the way you framed it. And the way I see it is that it's important. I mean, in this country, there has been bipartisan consensus on a number of issues. So I think, discussing these issues, why it's important, what are the trade-offs for society, for governments, for markets, for businesses, thinking about, where, it's really about embarking on a particular path. It's really, how long it takes, it's kind of hard to say, it's hard to define, how quickly the curve will bend. But I think if you don't sort of have the discussion and dialogue, and this is something that we've learned from other countries, having more of a bipartisan consensus along these lines can help countries at least have that measured and concerted dialogue in societies.
Yeah, I agree with that. And maybe on that subject, Eric, can I ask you to comment on the role that fiscal councils might play in a fiscal rule framework? Do you think that they're important? Do you think that countries that don't have them should get them? Do you think that they're effective? How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Michael. So I think this is, as I said, three-pronged approach, very important linchpin is to have some sort of, oversight function. And let me explain what I mean by that. So when we think about fiscal councils, where we're essentially talking about some kind of nonpartisan entities, and they're providing impartial analysis on fiscal policies. And it could be their monetary fiscal rules, not everywhere. I mean, in Canada, we have a parliamentary budget office, for instance. There's no fiscal rule, legal fiscal rule, but it's still providing a costing of different governments' policies. Many of these entities they assess the realism of macro fiscal forecasts of the government. They cost government initiatives, and they're becoming more and more common. We have about 54 councils as of end 2024. And the CBO could be considered a fiscal council as well. I mean, it's not monitoring a fiscal rule since the US doesn't have one. But what we found is that in countries where they work well, I mean, they can really provide sound independent analysis that can inform citizens. first and foremost, about the soundness of public finances. And what we found, for instance, the chart that Julian and Raphael put up, is that in our research, we found that countries that have sort of fiscal councils, defined, sort of strong fiscal councils, they tend to sort of attenuate this deficit bias that exists in policymaking. In other words, more and more parties of all stripes are talking about the importance of discipline. They also improve these kind of forecast errors in this kind of inherent optimism bias that exists in government forecasts. So they can introduce or inject discipline. Now, the important thing is that they, by communicating, by assessing, by providing independent technical expertise, they can raise the costs for governments to slip, right? I mean, because now there's this entity that kind of is providing an impartial analysis of what they are. We also believe they should not contribute to pro-cyclical policies. In other words, the government shouldn't always be reacting to what these fiscal councils are doing. Importantly, they need to be operationally independent. They have to have their own budget. They need to have access to information. They need to have a strong statutory bias to exist. And the point really is that they are helping ensure that everybody is aware what policymakers are doing when it comes to fiscal policy, and are providing sort of a realism check to what the governments are doing.
Yes, that makes sense. And I think in the U.S. context, I really think the Congressional Budget Office is one of the most important institutions in Washington, one of the most important institutions in the policymaking process. I find myself disagreeing with some of their estimates and with some of their methods as is natural, as you would naturally expect. But they really do, I think, serve as a referee, respected or feared, or some combination of the two by both political parties, and I think they do really keep the participants in the policy debate honest with the analysis they produce. The agency has conducted itself with just astonishing integrity over the decades, and I think that really kind of bubbles up from the internal culture of the agency. They not only strive to be nonpartisan, they are nonpartisan. They not only strive to be extremely professional, they are extremely professional. The staff is really high quality, and so I think in the U.S. this is an indispensable part of the policymaking process. German, on this subject, I think there is sometimes the assertion that these sorts of councils can be overly influential. If a government wants to spend more or tax less, that these councils can be an obstacle. Here I think about the views of some members of the Tory party toward the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK, for example. Particularly Liz Truss, who really viewed it as an obstacle. Do you? I mean, not to ask if you agree with the Tories, but do you kind of agree in general with the critique that perhaps these institutions have too much power, too much influence? Do you disagree with that? Do you think that they are an obstacle? Should they be an obstacle? How do you think about this?
So, in general, I disagree with this critique, which does not mean that there could not be a fiscal council that is given perhaps whose powers reach into areas which are typically preserved for parliaments, right? Of course, you could pass a law where, in a sense, Parliament gives away too much power to fiscal councils. Whether this is the case in the case of the OBR in the UK, I suspect it's not the case. But in principle, I could see this. I don't view this as being a real issue. It's far less of an issue than with independent central banks, right? Where you really have an entire policy area that's handed over to technocrats. I think one has to understand the limits of fiscal councils. And so this is maybe one area where the paper could maybe have given more, or possibly it's in the technical appendices, which I didn't read. So I think that fiscal councils really plausibly can only work in democracies. And the reason is that in any case, in a dictatorship, you're not going to be able to tie the hands of the dictator. Okay, so also more by definition. Now, having said that, then once you're in a democracy, you know, the power to tax and spend and decide on fiscal policy is the core of what parliaments control. So you're not going to give this to a bunch of technocrats. And so almost by definition, because fiscal councils only have a chance in democracies, but on the other hand, they cannot really have hard power. I find it very difficult to plausibly accuse these guys of overreach, right? I mean, they occupy a bit of a narrow territory of having influence without hard power, and it only really works in conjunction with democratic accountability. I mean, you need the public to react to the fiscal council. If you don't have that, they can't do anything, right? Now, having said that, they're better designed, less designed. What I would like to see, and maybe the literature exists, maybe you have done this, Julien or others in this paper, is to have a little more research on not just what institutional features make some fiscal councils more successful than others, but also in what context they are more successful than others, and maybe how the institutional design interacts with the content in which they operate. But the bottom line is that in order,
I'm going to say that you're actually advertising my paper, a forthcoming paper that I'm working on, precisely.
Wonderful. There we go. The answer we'll do it at the next occasion. So basically, I think that in order to shield yourself from these accusations, first you need an unimpeachable mandate, which is, you know, fiscal councils, like you said about the CBO, and I completely agree that the CBO is a fantastic institution, and I hope it stays that way, and I hope they not fall victim to the general political polarization and blowback against independent institutions that we have in the US. So good luck, CBO, hang in there. So you need them to analyze the consequences of fiscal actions. Just report to the public, you know, what's the cost? Okay, CBO does this very well. Then I think a very important point about successful fiscal frameworks, and this is brought out in the paper, is that you need some flexibility, right? It's like the paper says, it's necessary, not sufficient for a successful fiscal framework. Flexibility means there is some discretion. And so you need someone who says whether discretion is abused or not. That, for me, is the most important function of a fiscal council. A trusted authority that just says, this is an appropriate use of discretion, this is an inappropriate use of discretion. It cannot forbid the use of discretion, but it can flag it, right? So this is the watchdog function. And then third is, I think that in frameworks that are more complex, and I think frameworks generally have to be complex in order to be efficient, right? Just simple numerical rules don't work. You need fiscal councils as an intermediary to basically explain what's going on, right? Explain what a DSA means, how it works, and that intermediary function, it's a communication function, is also really important. And so as long as fiscal councils stick to those three things and do them well, I don't think anyone can complain about them.
I just like to say that the transparency aspect, I mean, I think the transparency of public finances, I mean, that's their role, right? Making public finances more transparent, easier to understand for the general.
Exactly. That was basically what I meant with my third point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just as government should observe fiscal constraints, I need to observe time constraints, and we're 4 minutes over. We could have kept this conversation going for much longer. And my apologies to the members of the audience whose questions that we didn't get to. I would encourage everybody to read the research note. The answers to your questions are likely in there, and it would encourage everybody to read it anyway, even if you don't have questions that we didn't get to. Let me thank everyone for being here, Julian and Raphael, for for their presentation, and Era and Jeremy for this excellent discussion. Let me especially thank everybody who's tuned in to watch this, and again, let me extend my thanks to everyone who will watch this this video recording in the future at their convenience. The IMF is doing such valuable and important work. And I'm very happy to be able to share that with all of you today. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, there we go.
Yes, hope that was good.
Very nice. I thought that was good.
Thank you.
I mean,
Great.
we could have talked for a while. That's
We could have-
so
we could
that's
have-
a very good sign. Nicely done, Julie and Raphael. I think Michael,
Yeah.
it was good.
Yeah, I
liked
thought it was
it.
great.
Yeah, it was good.
Thanks.
I hope people enjoyed it.
Thank you very
and,
much. Yeah.
Thanks again for
Yes.
for hosting us.
Yes, very happy to do it, and good to see you again, and good to see you
Good to
all.
see you again, and
Yeah,
we'll
good.
come knocking on your door again.
Yes,
soon.
please do. Please do. Feel free to knock anytime, and
I guess
good
I'll
luck-
see you
good luck
next week.